Hi, my name's Grigg, and welcome to a live update of Wicked Good Development. Today we're speaking with the one and only Ilkka from Sonatype to talk about the OpenSSL vulnerability. Good morning, Ilkka. How are you doing? I know it's actually afternoon for you.
Well, good morning to you. And yeah, I'm doing rather all right. Feels like a lot of the pressure off of this vulnerability steam has been kind of let out a little bit. So better than I was expecting, to be fair.
Awesome. So that's good, what we like to hear, especially when it comes to a vulnerability. So can you kind of talk me through what has kind of unfolded in the past week? Because on October 25th, there was an announcement that a critical software update would be coming out November 1st. So can you kind of bring me up to speed as to what was uncovered yesterday and some of your thoughts on why the announcement was actually so early?
Yeah, this is kind of actually a very different type of scenario than we're used to. Usually these things happen at a moment's notice, and it's sort of a mad dash to start patching immediately. This time around, has something a little bit different happened. So let me take you back to the distant past of last week when the project lead for OpenSSL, as well as the OpenSSL project itself, announced on its mailing list that it was going to have a new release in about a week's time. Now, there's nothing unusual about that. In fact, OpenSSL, in case you don't know what it is, it's a core part of the internet. It's essentially a component that is very widely used to generate the certificates that we use to sign secure internet communication. So anytime you go to a website that's running under HTTPS, as in secure website and things like this, OpenSSL is probably the system that creates the certificates. It's one of the most used things out there. So the project that's backing it up is very mature. It's been existing for a long time. They've got a very sort of mature process of how they, inform the world about new updates, and for good reason, right? OpenSSL, when there's a new version, it's something that pretty much any manufacturer of anything to do with the web has to take into account. So they have a policy of letting the world know a week in advance when new releases are about to come out. And in this particular case, they also announced that, by the way, this release will fix a security vulnerability that we have internally classed as critical. Now, that obviously was the thing that set alarms off. People went, "Oh my God, what's this mean?" The reason why this particular component is so ubiquitous and why it's so important that people react to critical vulnerabilities in it is that the very first ever named security vulnerability by the name of Heartbleed that happened in 2014, so nearly 10 years ago now. That was affecting OpenSSL, and in fact, with a very similar security vulnerability that we've seen now, kind of come out. So when OpenSSL has these security vulnerabilities, just like Log4j or any other big thing, it's very ubiquitous. It's spread everywhere. So understandably, the world kind of got a little bit nervous, maybe a little bit jittery in the InfoSec Twitter. Because we didn't know the details of the security vulnerability and so on. The project kind of rightly actually drove up attention. They kind of drummed up information and said, "Listen, let's go ahead and let the world know that this release is coming. Give everybody a little bit of lead time into getting information about it, knowing what OpenSSL they have installed, and give them a little bit of time to prepare." So by the time that the update actually came and the announcement came, most of us were well informed that it was coming. I'm sure there was a sizable amount of the population hitting F5 on the website as well.
So can you then tell me what does this impact for people? So you mentioned that is the certification, right? But what is the impact for people who are actually using these CVEs that are affected? Because based on what I was looking at, it's only a certain range that is affected.
Yeah, so let's just cut to the basics of what these vulnerabilities in the end are and what can happen. So first of all, this is actually two security vulnerabilities that came out yesterday. So that original critical, as it was announced, throughout the course of the week, the OpenSSL project worked with a bunch of security researchers to verify the vulnerability, look at its real life exploitability and things like that. And over the course of the week, that it actually turned out that in real life, the thing that they thought was a critical issue turn out not to be necessarily very easily exploitable. And I'll go into details what that means. So instead, they chose to downgrade it into two separate security vulnerabilities, both classed as high, but not critical. And that's pretty important in info security parlance, because the way that we do things is we say critical security vulnerabilities, immediate effect, high security vulnerabilities, very high priority, but not necessarily drop everything and fix it right now. There's also something called medium, low, and no impact criticalities as well. So it's quite meaningful that they decided to drop that down. So the two high security vulnerabilities, they're what we call buffer overflow vulnerabilities that lead to memory corruption. Very very sort of important sounding words, because they usually are. Memory corruption and buffer overflows are actually exactly the same thing that happened with Heartbleed, the original sort of big bad security vulnerability. What's different about this time around, though, is that it's very contained when you can actually execute these security vulnerabilities. So first of all, you have to be on OpenSSL version 3.0 or higher. And good news is OpenSSL, the free series, has only been released in the last year or so. So real life adoption of that code base is actually relatively low. When you look at the internet and you look at for example usage adoption things, we look at our customers using it, you can actually see that only about less than a fraction of 1% of websites today out there are actually adopting this technology. Most of them are still on the previous mainline version, which is something called 1.1.1. So luckily, the containment, the amount of impact that could have happened, is relatively low. There are still products out there that are already implemented. Things like Node.js, relatively new versions of distributions of Linux, relatively new long-term support versions of Linux, they all contain this. Also, for example, Fedora Linux itself delayed a release because they wanted to make sure that they take this update into account. So that's the good news. Now, coming back to the security vulnerability itself, there are memory overflows and memory corruption issues, yes. But luckily, most operating systems today, with the way that they work, actually have controls, runtime controls that mitigate a lot of the potential effects of that, what that might have. So what that basically means is, although theoretically on paper, this could lead into a situation where an attacker could send a fake certificate into the system that would fail, and they would embed some bad code into that fake certificate. In real life, what probably ends up happening is, the system will slow down, which is why they're calling it a denial of service vulnerability. But in practice, it's highly unlikely that you're going to see remote code execution occurring as a result of this. There are some other mitigating circumstances. For example, this vulnerability only occurs after a certificate is validated, which means that it has to have a legitimate certificate authority that has signed it, or some very, very hacky exceptions to run it in a very unsafe mode. Either which way, you wouldn't expect this to happen in production, right? It'd be very unlikely. So the sort of collective breath about this is, it only affects versions 3.0 all the way through to 3.06. 3.07, which is now out since yesterday, has fixed the issue, and luckily the exploitability is relatively low. Now that's the breather. That's the good news about this thing. Unfortunately, the last sort of caveat of this sort of stuff is that these sort of vulnerabilities typically don't come alone, right? They're not the only things that are out there. We've had a lot of attention being cast on this particular issue, so there's no telling over time whether or not bad actors might find a new way of exploiting this. It's very often that you use chains of security vulnerabilities as a part of a compromise to do something. So it could potentially be used for denial of service attacks in some contained scenarios. It could be potentially used in the future in conjunction with other security vulnerabilities, or it could be that somebody looks at this vulnerability and discovers similar issues in other places. But in practice, that's the reason why the industry has kind of breathed a little bit of a collective sigh. Coming back to your very original question, Katie, about why did we get to know about this a week in advance? I thought it was actually a real luxury this time around to be able to
I would agree.
sit down and prepare for it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was like a nice change of pace, but I was also wondering, like you said, like these usually come in 2s and 3s. So I don't know if that's indicative now of like what are things to come, right? Is this something we're going to start seeing more often? Who knows?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, to ponder on, Katie, because the reality is these things happen all the time. Critical security vulnerabilities are a dime a dozen. As we've kind of recently reported, there's been an instance of over 100,000 next-gen supply chain attacks alone in the last 3-4 years. So security vulnerabilities, in open source components are pretty attractive targets for attackers and security testers, and everybody who's trying to find vulnerabilities in code in general, because high adoption means high potential yield.
Mm-hmm.
If you find an exploit that works and that is scalable. So there's bound to be attention on this on all sides. But the real problem really isn't that the security vulnerabilities exist. The real problem is our ability to react to them. So
Yep.
We've spoken to a number of clients and customers and people in the industry over the last week, and generally speaking, you get two kinds of reactions. You get the organizations that have a process for dealing with impending security issues. They have a catalog of their software that they've installed, and they have a ready-made workflow for it. For those organizations, it's a matter of 5 minutes. Run a query on a database. Where's OpenSSL installed? What versions do we have? Now we know, right? So we're ready for the patch. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is, oh, this was overhyped. I was woken up from my crypt for nothing, type of thing. And that's very indicative of a non-existent or very immature software supply chain process, as in they probably lack the workflow and the tooling and the discipline to have answers to these questions at a moment's notice. And I think increasingly, if anything, that this was a reminder of, I thought it was a really good sort of wake-up call to get your house in order, to get a little bit of an audit going. And I think that's the lesson that we should distill out of this all. This time around, we kind of averted a bigger, more critical security vulnerability, but once again, the kind of basics that we learned with Log4j are exactly the same thing, right? Know what you have, know where it's being installed, and have a process for patching. It's no harder than that, but at the same time, if you've never done it before, or you only do it on high levels of incidents like this, it can be very problematic. So just that's kind of the lesson that I take from this is these sort of basic forms really do matter.
Ilkka, I couldn't have wrapped this up better myself if I tried. So like Ilkka said, guys, know what you have in your code, where it's in your code, and really have a process for how to patch it. And that can help you stay vigilant and ahead of the curve. Till next breach, this is all we've got. Thanks, Ilkka, for hopping on today to explain the OpenSSL vulnerability to me.
Thank you very much for having me today.